everyone, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our newsletter and our great sponsors, your Dolce Vita, Italy Rooting, and Abiativo Casa. And my guest today is Arnie Aranci, and so welcome, Arnie. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be here.
So I usually start out with, I guess, a very simple question. Where is your family from in Italy, and when did they arrive?
My father's side is from Arezzo, and he's actually from a little like a suburb of there. It's actually in the countryside called Foiana della Chiana, really tiny. And my mother is from Livorno, major seaport there on the west coast. And my father came here as a little boy, maybe 3 or 4 years old. Probably in, let me think. I don't want to take too long to do the math. It was probably in the 20s. And he grew up here in Hamden, Connecticut, just outside New Haven. Went back to Italy with the American Army, pushing the Nazis out of Italy. Worked his way up the peninsula. And when he got to Livorno, he came down with malaria, and he ended up being stationed, sort of permanently at a base they set up there as the army made its way up farther on. And that's where he met my mother. And she was a local girl whose cousin was working at the army base. They had local Italian girls working there. When he would drive home, my mom's aunt, he would see my mom, and eventually they got to know each other, and they ended up getting married there in Italy. And he shipped out with the Americans when they all came home, and she came over on a ship full of war brides right after the war.
Wow, that's so interesting. So I think you're the first person whose mom was an American war bride. I have a good friend in England, and his mom was a war bride, but his dad was in England. So, and a similar kind of story. He came back and did that. But I didn't realize that now they had a ship specifically for war brides to come back.
Any ships. My research for my book, I was fascinated. Thousands of war brides there really were, and I forget the operation name. They had a name for it too that the War Department had. Where just many of these ships that were, converted from, whatever they might be, passenger liners, crew ship, crew, for troops ships, and they had many of these ships coming over full of war brides. As a matter of fact, we had a little clipping somewhere in our things. War brides arrived in New York, the ship that my mom was on. So yeah, there was quite an operation there. All these war brides. I didn't realize so many American GIs married girls over there.
Yeah, I didn't either. So did they ever explain? Was it difficult for them to get married? Did they have to go through a lot of stuff to get to marry her in Italy?
They never told me anything like that, but reading some of the other little stories that people posted online, because I did some research about, how did these people get married? It didn't take too much, like permission from your commanding officer and a couple of papers, and that was it.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. Um, I would have thought it would have been much more difficult. Um, I've seen a couple of movies, not so much about Italy, but about Japan, and it seemed to be difficult in Japan if you wanted to marry. But I suppose that was a different situation. Um, who knows how they did that kind of stuff. Um, so do you know what your I'm going to start with your mom's family because she lived there. Do you know what her father did, or um what her background is?
Really interesting. He worked with a lot at scrap metal places, but during the wars, and as a matter of fact, even in between, he did salvage diving, with the big helmet and the whole thing. And I have pictures of him sitting, on the deck with some of his friends, and they got their stuff on. They're holding their helmets, and so yeah, they would go down and pump air into the ships and try to raise them and things like that. So I always thought when I was a kid I always thought that would be so cool to do, you know.
Yeah, that is cool. I didn't even realize they were doing it back then. Um, but not that way that they were actually, raising the ships. I know they do it now. Uh, yeah, that's a line of work I haven't heard from Italy yet.
farmer or some artisan or something.
Right, right. Or, the farmer. Yeah, right. Um, and how about your dad's family? You know what their industry was or occupation?
I really didn't ask my dad about that, and his father died young. Matter of fact, that was one of the things during the Depression. My parents were older. My father was 50 when he had me. Um, so he pretty much was supporting his family. Like, that was it, eighth grade, and he was out working. And he didn't tell me too much about his dad. So I didn't know him. So I couldn't really speak to that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that too, but since I didn't want to get too personal, but since you brought it up, I was saying, yeah, Arnie looks pretty young to have a dad the same age as my dad.
Yeah. Yeah. So they were both old, and my mother was 10 years younger. So she had me when she was 40, and I'm 14 years older. I mean, younger than my sister. So I was either a surprise or, a little surprise package there in their, later years.
Well, I think my dad was too, because uh his sister was his next up sister was, I think, 7 years difference, which isn't a big deal. But his oldest brother was much, much older than him, like 18, 19 years, 20 years, or something like that. My mom's family, my grandmother was like pregnant every, like, 2 years, 18 months or something like that. She had 11. My dad had five. So, big difference there.
Yeah.
Um, so what'd your dad do after he came back from the war?
Well, he was a baker. He was a baker before the
Uh,
war, baker after the war, and always worked at little shops and just, wage earning baker.
and how'd you stay so thin? Your father was a baker.
You know, I was a chunky little guy because my mom cooked great stuff, and my father, came home with the baked goods. And wasn't until I was a teenager that I said, I think I'm going to try to stretch out a little. Oh, I think my body just stretched out. I shot up. I'm tall, like 6'2", so I think I stretched out a little.
So, my uncle was a baker in Corona, and it's funny because I didn't know this. I knew they made pizza there, but I was able to get the recipe from the nephew of the owner of the bakery to get the pizza recipe, um, and this is like 50, 60 years after my uncle was making pizzas. I was able to get the recipe, and I only got it because the guy promised he would never give it away to anybody but the family. And he said, well, I have to give it to you because your uncle was baking it. Um, did he work at a big bakery or just worked at a local place or?
Couple of jobs that he had. One of them was just at a small little bakery. That was it was small. But then once or twice he had a job at it was called Grand Way back then, sort of a stop and shop. So he was in the bakery department there too.
And so now did they originally in Connecticut, or did they go from New York to Connecticut, or what was their migration path?
Pretty much straight to New Haven. My father's family, and he grew up here in Hamden. And after the war, when he was married, they stayed here in Hamden, as I have too.
Yeah, and I don't think people realize that there's a big Italian community in New Haven, right? Or
New Haven,
was.
heard of New Haven pizza. Pretty famous around it. They get great ratings. Matter of fact, Pepe's here in New Haven. On the wall, they have all pictures of the stars that have been there, Frank Sinatra and whatnot, who come to New Haven after they've, been in New York or wherever.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that at all. Um, so now have you what kind of research have you done with the family, and have you done DNA and things like that?
No, I have not done DNA, and I contacted, and as you may have read on the back of the book, I do stay in touch with my family in Italy quite a bit on my mother's side. I have a cousin who I used to spend summers with her family, and we're very close. And but on my father's side, as far as tracing that back, I contacted his family and talked to some of the relatives, and they tried going back, and it reached a dead end with my father's father because he had been an orphan, and the orphanage where the records were burnt down. And so that was kind of a dead end. But I haven't really put a great deal of effort into trying to, trace. I know your site is a genealogy, and maybe I'll start down that path next. But at this point, I was just writing the book.
Well, the interesting thing about doing the DNA, you'd probably be able to find out if you did it, because you would probably wind up, finding some second cousins or third who might know the story or know where you're from. I know several people who have done that, and that's how they found their roots. In fact, um, the interview I just did was really interesting because I didn't know who her father was, and she used to walk through the streets of East Harlem in New York, trying to find people that looked like him, because she knew that he was from that, from the neighborhood. Um, but yeah, it's so many people have found people like that, through that path. Um,
That
and
they didn't even know that they had half brother and half sister met each other. They were both here in America, and it turned out they had so many similar traits. They were both into music. They both were performers. It's amazing. And then I saw them perform together. So yeah, so things can happen when you do that.
well, yeah, and I have a good friend who found his older brother that he never knew existed. The father never talked about it. He believes that the father had the affair before he married his mother.
Hmm.
And back then, we're talking 70 years ago. Back then, they would just hand the kids off sometime. There was no paperwork. I have another friend. She has no paperwork. She doesn't know how she wound up in the parents' hands.
Wow,
Uh,
amazing.
Yeah, and she was she thinks that her father, similar situation. Some, young girl was having a baby. Her parents couldn't have children, and they just gave them the baby because she didn't have a birth certificate.
Wow. Yeah, it's very different from nowadays.
Oh, much, much different. My kids are adopted, and it's much different. They're checking you out all the time. For every little thing, which of course is fine. It's fair enough to do that. But uh, yeah, I think in my friend's case, that his brother was just handed off to a couple, and that was the end of it. Um, so what's the book about? Let's talk about the book a little bit.
Oh, okay. Um, Now that you know a little bit about my mom, you'll see how this was inspired by them, but it's very loosely based on them because it's quite a drama and a story of survival, which is definitely her story too. But the book, it's about a girl, 19-ish, growing up in Livorno. So I tried to use a lot of the things that I had experienced and I had seen from my summers there and and a lot of the things from my mom's story too. But again, it's definitely a fiction. But the girl is growing up there or she's trying to survive there in Livorno, which is occupied by the Germans at the time. And the Americans and the British are bombing the heck out of it. It's one of the most bombed cities in Europe, certainly in Italy. And because it was a commercial port and it was very vital to the Germans to bring in their supply. So she's trying to survive there, and the Germans loot her home, which there's actually a little story in there about that actually happened to my mom about, first of all, the bombings that she used to describe, sky being black with planes, the Americans or the British planes. It's just they came over, in waves. She would tell me these are like the direct stories from her, and running to bomb shelters and trying to survive, and telling me about the rats. She couldn't look at squirrels here in America, and I said, why? She said, because they remind me of the rats in the bomb shelters. So it's amazing, these like connections, and the PTSD kind of thing. And the Germans loot the protagonist, Nikola, who I named after my mom, Nikola. The Germans loot her home. They take her sewing machine, and now she's a seamstress. So now they're really hard up, and she finds work with a countess on Montenero, which is in Livorno, but it's a hill. So Livorno's it's beautiful about Livorno. You could be right down on the ocean, then you can go up in the hills, and it's beautiful up there, beautiful views. And so she has a villa up in Montenero. So she works for her, and her chauffeur brings her Nicola back and forth to her home. And while she's there, of course, I had to put some romance in there. The Contessa's grandson, about Nicola's age, falls in love with her. But Nicola has a boyfriend who's in the army. And so, she's pining for him, and she's trying to not get involved with this other fellow. And through a series of, happenstance meetings, she ends up getting involved with the partisans. And that's where I did some research about women who became known as staffette. And if you were a staffetta, you could be sort of a runner for, undercover, plans or even weapons and things. And of course, many women actually, I didn't know this either. I found out in my research that there were many Italian women also just literally as fighters in the partisans, which is not something that got passed down in history, and is starting to come out more now. And you look at the pictures, you see them carrying guns. But Nicola doesn't get involved in that way, but she does get involved in the staffetta sort of courier kind of thing. And that leads her into all sorts of danger and close calls. And, I don't want to give away too much. And so that's kind of where the book goes. And if you know about my mom, as about the war bride, I don't want to give away any endings, but that's kind of where we're heading to with the book.
Yeah, that's cool. I've done two books, one on research and one about, my banking career. And I'd love to be able to do a historical fiction, but I'm having trouble, like, building the characters like you just described and things like that. But I have an interesting story with my fourth great grandmother, who was the Duchess of Capricotta in Molise, and she left the family with a French soldier, French officer, probably the late 1700s or something like that. And then she came back, and she supposedly married a doctor. And then after the war, I know she died in Paris in like I think 1812 or 1815 or something like that. But I'd love to do some kind of story like that. But uh, I'm not good enough writer, or um, I don't know what the right word is, but to be able to build the characters like you just described, that's really cool to be able to do that.
Sure. You know what you got to do is, I don't know if this is good advice, but I just tried to entertain myself and ask myself, what would I want to know about what makes this guy tick, and how would he change if this or that happened to him? And I didn't set out to, I said when I first started, I told some friends about my mother's story over dinner a few years ago. And the wife said, "Oh, that's a hot genre. If you write a historical fiction about, romance there in Italy." And I said, "Geez, you know what? I didn't, I didn't put any pressure on myself. Let me just go home and just see what happens." And little by little, just like I said, I had the bare bones of it because of my mother's story. And I just kind of filled it in with this whole thing of just entertain yourself, Arnie, and don't try to think you have to write a book or anything. And it led me down the road of some research, ask some relatives,